Hi, my name is Megan Azadi. I'm a UX visual designer here at Infragistics, and this is my presentation on why simple should be better, not boring. In the last year or so, I keep hearing the same requests over and over from my clients. They're really interested in a flat design or the metro look and feel. They show us examples of how they've attempted to accomplish this. It's become so popular now that everybody's asking for it. The problem that I keep running into is that sometimes these concepts can be boring. The simple design should really enhance the interface and not leave it drab. So how I want to get started today is I want to actually kind of define what the concept of flat UI is and sort of give you a little bit of background. Flat UI really started with Windows 8. As Microsoft referred to it, the metro look and feel. They've abandoned that term, but that's sort of kind of what's stuck in people's minds. Apple really solidified the flat UI when they came out with iOS 7 last year, and it's just become very, very popular. I have 5 descriptive phrases that I would use to describe what flat design really is. The first one is it has minimal design elements. Here I have an example of a calculator from the iOS 6 version and the iOS 7 version for the iPhone. As you can see on the left-hand side, it looks like a calculator, feels like a calculator. It has a leathery texture in the background. It has bezels to make the buttons look raised. It just really looks and feels like a calculator. On the right, iOS 7's version, it just is a digital representation of what a calculator really is. It's flat, it has very flat lines, the fonts are just very simple. It is a drastic difference between what it was and what it is now. Flat design also has good typography. In past years, technology has really hindered the ability to put exciting fonts on your applications and websites. And as a designer, it becomes really annoying, especially for us, those of us who started out in print. We really got to experiment with different fonts and do lots of different typography things when they would printed things out. It wasn't the same in software for a while, but now technology is starting to catch up and we have so many more options with fonts. We're able to use these great fonts in our applications. So what we can do here is we can actually use typography to change the way something looks. We can use it as a design element, not just as a way to see information. You can see on the left and the right, I have the previous version of the weather application and the new version of the weather application. And you can see that they've done a lot with the font. This app actually looks and feels. You can see that they're using this very light, thin version for the degrees.
They've laid it out a little bit differently, and the font just changes the way that it looks.
Flat design also has a lot simpler iconography. Again, with the same weather application, you can see that on the left-hand side, with the previous version, the sun looks like a sun, the clouds look like clouds. It isn't as, it's very representative of what it is. Whereas again, these are digital representations. The icons on the right, it just is an outline of a cloud or a sun instead of actually looking like the thing that it is. It's very much simplified. Flat design also has larger elements. One of the things that has really come out of flat design are these larger elements in general. Larger buttons, larger text, larger amounts of negative space. Part of this is due in the fact that we're trying to make sure that we have enough space for touchable areas for mobile and tablet applications, and now that there are more desktops that are starting to have touch sensitivity to them. But it's also overflowed into regular desktop applications as well. Just the look and feel of it, people are liking it. It's really apparent in this Windows 8 screenshot. There are larger elements on each of these sections. The buttons are larger because each of these squares are actually buttons. Even though they're bubbling up a little bit of content. The touchable area where it says start is larger. And then the frame around the application, it's a huge amount of negative space. Flat design has also kind of incorporated brighter and bolder colors. Because there's a lot simpler design elements going on, these colors are really starting to pop out and add more visual interest to the applications. As you can see with Windows again, these colors really stand out against this dark purple background. It pops really nicely. see all these great things that make up flat design, but you can also easily think that each of these applications have made some great choices, but it doesn't always go that way. I think that flat design can take a boring turn. For example, I still prefer the previous versions of the iPad calendar to the new version. I really liked when I opened up my calendar that it was a desktop calendar. It felt like a desktop calendar. When I turned to the next month, it almost felt like I was tearing a page off. And the frame around it just sort of added something to it. Now that they've updated iOS, it's sort of boring. I just don't find it as fun to use the calendar anymore. I really like this example because I feel like it's a great example of where Apple missed the mark. And I think that they've missed it on a few other of the native apps, like iBooks, for example, where in others they succeeded and did a great job, like the weather app that I showed you previously. Now, we do reviews of applications now and again, and when we review our applications with our clients, we still get the same sort of boring feeling, and it's mostly worse than this Apple version. I feel like, you know, the calendar is still pretty nice in comparison to what I've seen. But, you know, it can be done right, too. Simplistic design can really concentrate on the content and user experience and really provide a great experience for the user. For example, on this application by National Geographic, it has a nice clean font. There's plenty of white space around the application and has simplistic icons that I mentioned. All these elements combined get me to the main point right away, planning my trip to London. So what do we do so that we don't miss the mark and we actually do a good job with our simplistic designs? I've come up with two sort of ways that we can do that. The first thing that I think we need to do is we need to go back to basics. Another word for flat design is simplistic. So what does that mean, go back to basics? I think about the things that I learned in my graphic design classes, intro to graphic design, not the more advanced ones. I start thinking about typography, the colors, the use of negative space, shapes, lines, etc. The very things that we sort of defined as flat design. So how do we take this to the next level? You know, what can we do with these basics that will make the flat design better? You can start by enhancing the typography. One of the great things about not being hindered by typography is being able to pick a new font, stepping outside of your Helvetica box or your Microsoft box. You can still find a lot of designs out there with the same typefaces, and so I like to think that there's more out there as far as typography is concerned. For example, Groupon uses this font called Proxima Nova in all of their applications, and I just think it's a very nice take on a font that's pretty traditional. It's similar to Helvetica, but it's not quite Helvetica. You can also change the font size. What I really like about this Fitbit application is that it does two things by changing the font size of the number of steps or miles. It does one thing where it highlights the important information. 1799 steps, that's more important than how the word steps itself. But it also sort of creates this sort of visual appeal to it by mixing up the font sizes. It keeps it from just appearing boring or standard. They also did it again on the right. My name is more important than the date that I joined, for example. You can also use different fonts. I really like how Evernote is using two different fonts for their application. They are using a serif font for the headers, and then they're just using a regular sans serif font for the content itself. It gives the header its sort of own visual element to it that could not have been accomplished if they just used a sans serif font for the headers as well. And mixing it up just is a great way of adding visual appeal to the application as well. Another way of enhancing the typography is transforming the text, making it all uppercase. This Epicurious app uses uppercase in a couple different places to sort of change up the way the font is displayed, where this is the shopping list on the right-hand side, or the navigation on the left. I want to change my search for my main ingredient or my meal course. That's another way that you can enhance the typography without doing too much. It's just enough to change the way that it looks to add visual appeal. We talked about different colors or multiple colors earlier in flat design, but what I've really liked about what's come out of flat design is the use of brighter and bolder colors. This green is it's not a very familiar green. It's not used a lot. I mean, you see it, but it's not the main color. And I really like how Evernote used this green and the hues of this green in order to create their design. It's a brighter green. It's more. I also like it when in flat design we use multiple colors. This is two different examples. On the left is Tumblr, and on the right is fab.com. And they use multiple colors to represent different navigation items or different actions. Tumblr, for example, uses different colors for the different type of posts that you can make on your Tumblr account. Fab.com sort of highlights their different sections using different colors. They actually follow it through on their website as well. So it really sort of gives you this kind of sense of navigation because you know I'm in the home section because I'm on blue. You can also add padding in crowded areas. Using negative space is a very important tool in flat design because you're not using a lot of other design elements. For example, in this is Gmail, and I love using this example. I've used it before. Basically what is going on here is we have this list of all of my promotional emails on the right, and you can see they're very squished together and makes it really hard to read. But when we add padding to it, it opens it up and it just sort of makes it such a nicer look for the list. You can read the list a little bit easier, and it just adds a little something extra to it. And I think this is a great way of adding negative space that can really enhance an application. Another way that you can use negative space is you can use it to frame sections of content. You don't have to put an actual stroke around something, or you don't have to put a drop shadow around something to make it frame the content. For example, here the content is framed mostly by negative space, and it is a great way of just organizing content and making it easier to read. The second thing that we can do to our designs is to evolve the design elements that we previously relied on so heavily, previous design trends. Previous to flat design, designers relied heavily on design elements to bring life to our designs, such as shadows, bevels, gradients, all sorts of different things. And as designers, sometimes it feels like our first instinct in designing for flat design is to strip all of those design elements away and add a ton of white space. Obviously, this approach isn't going to work all of the time, but what we need to do is take those elements that we used to use so heavily and evolve them to work side by side with those flat elements that we were talking about, the basics. And this will really help enhance our designs with flat design. The previous design trend that I want to look at is shadows. Drop shadows were used pretty heavily prior to the flat design trend. Drop shadows like this one. This is an example from the alert from iOS. What it did is it would add dimensions to objects. It would make it feel like it was lifted off the page. This creates like a huge impact, so it actually feels like it's really three-dimensional. But I think that shadows can still be used now, but what we need to do is show dimension but less of it. This is a good example. This is Google Maps, and what it does is they add a slight drop shadow behind their boxes, just enough so that it feels like it's lifted off of the map, but not too much. It still creates a simple, impactful way of showing the map, but it doesn't take away from the content that I'm trying to search for. It's just a lot less dramatic, and I think this is a good example. Shadows can also be used to frame sections of content. For example, here you can see that there is a drop shadow on the left-hand side separating the two sections. It's a very light drop shadow, but it gives the illusion that the search section is kind of slid in behind your list or your search list. And I think that really enhances the way that it looks. And also, there's a drop shadow behind the boxes of recipes as well. It sort of frames it without too much. It's a very, very slight drop shadow. Images is another way that we can sort of enhance our designs nowadays. Images were used in very basic ways previously. We were using the hero image. There was always this big image at the top of our websites. And then we framed all our images in these boxes below. This was a very popular way to lay out a design. But what I'm really liking about flat design is how this isn't confined to boxes anymore. We're not using hero images the way that we used to. I love how Bing uses their images. They use their images to fill negative space, and it changes all the time, so it even makes it more exciting every time you go to the Bing homepage. For example, this is a great image of a waterfall. The Bing search bar is still prominent, but they're filling the negative space with the image itself, and I think this is a great way to use an image. One of my favorite details in iOS 7 is the blurring effect that they're using with their images. I don't know if you've realized this or not, but the image on the left is my lock screen on my iPhone. The background is actually my lock photo that I have that you see when you turn on my phone. So if you ever change your photo, your lock screen sort of changes because your image blurs in the background and it has different colors. It has a sort of blurred artistic effect. The right screenshot is Facebook's new Paper app. Now, instead of just pulling down on your phone to change your settings with a generic background, they actually blurred my Facebook cover photo, and that's what's showing in the background of this screen. iOS 7 introduced this blurring effect, and every application is running with it, and I think it's great. Adds so much appeal to the applications, and it's a creative way to change backgrounds. In general, I think it's safe to say that stepping outside of the box with how we use images can really enhance our applications and our websites. Apple used a lot of textures in their previous versions of iOS because they were representing real objects. Now, I've showed you these two pictures before of the calculator as well as the calendar, and they both use heavy textures to represent their real-life objects. I don't think that we need to stop using textures now, but we just need to use them in different ways. We can use them as a settled background. I really like how USA Today incorporated texture into their design. Most online news apps and websites just have the same news layout with the white background or black background. They all easily start looking the same over and over. I feel like I'm on the same news site and it's a different application. But USA Today really set themselves apart when they added this texture background to their website and their iPad app. Another thing that we can do is we can fill the negative space with the texture. I really like how Etsy is using a texture in the background of their navigation to add visual interest without taking away from the navigation itself. I think that there's several different ways that we can use textures now in flat design without taking away from the content. Gradients are another example of a design element that we relied on heavily, for example, in iOS. Gradients were used everywhere. You can see that here in the header and the buttons, they have their own form of gradients to sort of give them their own elements, like the buttons are sort of embedded into the header. Every screenshot I've shown you of the previous versions of iOS 6, they have really strong gradients on everything, from buttons to backgrounds. Now, the idea of having a gradient sort of goes against the concept of flat design if you really are talking about the basics of it. But I think you can still use a gradient in flat design and it can add something to the design. One way that I think that we can start using gradients is to use them to fill negative space. Similarly, how we talked about filling them with images or textures, we can do that with gradients as well. This is an image I've previously shown you from Google Maps, and they're actually using a slight gradient in the background to fill the space of the negative space for the background. And I think it's a great use of a gradient. I think you can also use a gradient to still add visual appeal. I don't know if you can tell this here. There's a slight gradient in the header of this Curious application. It makes it look more like a drawer, but it doesn't add too much of a gradient that it has like this lifted off the page or 3D effect. And I think it's a great way of combining the older elements with new elements. In conclusion, if you look at almost every single one of my examples, you'll notice that they're all using different elements that I've mentioned in this presentation, but not all of them. So what I think that we need to think about is we should use these various design elements to enhance the design of our applications, but we should use them in moderation. Just enough to keep the application from being boring, but not too much away to take away from the main attraction, the content. Looking at a map or looking at recipes should be more important than the surrounding elements. As my final example, I think that Mint.com does a great job of using flat design, but still incorporating some of the elements that I talked about. They do have the simple icons, but they have the big typography, and they're using the typography as a visual element. They have the brighter colors in their graph. They also even have a slight gradient and drop shadow on the left-hand side. So they're doing a little bit here and there to make it better, but they're not overdoing it either. Again, thank you for listening. My name is Megan Azadi. I am a UX visual designer here at Infragistics, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Simple should be better, not boring.